since we've heard a couple of experts talking about campaign finance and heard from the two main data organizations, I wanted to have a panel of some of the best reporters on campaign finance to come talk about how they actually generate story ideas and execute their stories. So we have four people with us today. We have Michael Beckel, who is the research director of Issue 1. He had spent many years before that at the Center for Public Integrity and Center for Responsive Politics. And most important in his life is that he was a Paul Miller Fellow in 2015-2016. Federica Scouten is a CNN Politics national political writer, where she focuses on money in politics. And before that, she had several years at USA Today, writing about campaign finance issues. Anu Narayanswamy is the data reporter for the political enterprise team at the Washington Post with a focus on money in politics. Previous to that, she was investigative reporter with the Sunlight Foundation and the Center for Public Integrity. And Rachel Shorey is a software engineer in the interactive news department at the New York Times, and she primarily works on large data collections. I've asked each of them to talk about a different slice of the campaign finance space, and then each will talk for 8 or 10 minutes, and then I'll have time for just general Q&A for all of them. Michael's going to give an overview with some very specific tips and resources, and he has a very good tip sheet that he's provided to us and that we're emailing to you right now. Fredreka is going to talk about how to source out money in politics stories, how to go beyond just getting the numbers from open secrets, and how you can build your own data sets beyond the FEC numbers. Anu is going to talk about FEC numbers and what you can get beyond campaign contributions, such as expenditures, and how you can build stories from those. And then Rachel's going to talk about how to work with all those small Act Blue and Win Red donations that both of our speakers today were talking about and that have become huge parts of recent campaign cycles. So I want to thank all four of you for taking the time to come talk to the Paul Millers. And I'm going to turn it over to Michael, who the former Paul Miller. This is what the Paul Millers used to dress like every day. Every time that they got together, everybody was suited up. It was a much more formal organization before. So I'll turn it over to Michael. Thank you. And we'll hear from all four and then move on to Q&A.
Thanks so much for having me today. It's a pleasure to be back with the National Press Foundation and all of this year's Paul Millers. I am going to share my screen to go through a quick slide deck that I believe you will all have access to, or you will all be getting access to shortly as well. But as Chris said, I started my career in Washington, D.C., working at OpenSecrets.org for 3 years, learned everything under the sun about money and politics, and then jumped into doing more money and politics reporting at the Center for Public Integrity. And for the last 4 years, I've been the research director at Issue 1, which is a bipartisan political reform organization based in Washington, D.C. And for me, I think one of the big things that I like about campaign finance data, it's important to look for trends as well as outliers. I think both of those things can help inform story ideas. Oftentimes a good story is going to come from the trend, a changing trend, or a number that really pops out from the other numbers in the data. And I'm going to focus on a few things that I've put together recently for Issue 1. So leadership PACs are one area that almost every member of Congress has one of these extra political committees that sometimes they don't get a lot of scrutiny or attention. According to Issue 1's research, about 92% of members of Congress have leadership PACs. Right now, there's only 4 senators who don't have leadership PACs and only about 10% of House members who don't have leadership PACs. And the typical member of Congress during the last 2-year election cycle raised about $130,000 for their leadership PAC. These ostensibly are vehicles that were created and blessed by the FEC back in the 1970s for members of Congress to give away money to like-minded candidates and political allies to gain clout within Congress. But there's also concerns about them because they are vehicles for special interests to buy access to lawmakers, and there's very few regulations about how leadership PACs spend their money. And this has led to both liberals and conservatives decrying leadership PACs as slush funds. And occasionally, if you are going through your leadership PAC filings for your congressional delegation or a particular member, you might find something that leads to a good standalone story. And here are a few examples of some recent news stories about leadership PACs, and highly encourage people to pay attention to these political committees. I also have spent a lot of time in my career looking at dark money in elections. And when I talk about dark money, I mean spending by opaque entities in elections that do not disclose their donors the way that candidates do, or political parties do, or super PACs generally do. And basically, these have proliferated since the Citizens United decision back in 2010. And we've seen three main ways that dark money flows into elections. We've seen a proliferation of spending by 501c4 social welfare organizations, groups that register with the IRS under that section of the tax code. We've also seen some major dark money spending by groups that are registered under section 501c6 of the tax code, the designation that most trade associations use. And we've also seen a proliferation of spending by certain business entities. Limited liability companies in certain states in particular are basically black boxes. Think Delaware, for instance, and there can be dark money flowing through those, either by making expenditures for political ads themselves or by giving money to a super PAC. And here are some examples of standalone stories that I was able to write in my time at the Center for Public Integrity by uncovering donors to dark money. So the drug lobby giving a bunch of money to a dark money group, or labor unions giving money to a big dark money group, or a major corporation giving money to a dark money group. And how might you find information about where dark money donors are actually coming from? I've identified on this slide 5 main places that sometimes you can find these needles in the haystack. Occasionally on FEC expenditure data, there are filings that lobbyists have to file with Congress called LD-203 filings. So any political contribution that a registered lobbyist makes, if they are giving to a dark money group occasionally, you'll see those contributions detailed on LD-203 filings. Labor unions have to file annual reports with the Department of Labor that detail all of the money that goes out of them. And so you can see expenditures, you can see contributions to politically active dark money groups on LM2 filings with the Department of Labor. And some companies are voluntarily disclosing information. There's a group called the Center for Political Accountability that runs a website called trackyourcompany.org that has a really good list of all the companies that have those voluntary disclosures. And if you're looking at a nonprofit, all nonprofits have a requirement to file a 990 report with the IRS, and there's expenditure data that gets reported on those forms. So for a big project we did at Issue 1, we tried to take all those different data sets and build upon the great work that places like Open Secrets have done, and some of the work that we did at the Center for Public Integrity. And we put this all together for the top 15 political dark money groups. And we went through and we built out this spreadsheet that you can access on these links here. And so if you are ever interested to see if a company or a trade association or a labor union or some other nonprofit entity has a history of making dark money donations, this is a really great spreadsheet to cross-reference and look at. The odds are if a major trade association was giving money to a dark money group or multiple dark money groups in one election cycle, they're likely to continue doing that in the future. So, having as part of your reporting practice, gathering these documents can lead to really great stories every once in a while. Additionally, like I said, dark money coming in the form of LLCs and these limited liability companies has been playing an increasing role. And one of the big concerns about all dark money in general is that it could be the source for nefarious money coming into our election, money from foreign nationals who are prohibited from spending money in our elections. And in fact, the Justice Department in recent years has alleged that this has happened at least twice with limited liability companies. Money from one Malaysian financier allegedly went through an LLC to support a pro-Barack Obama super PAC a few years ago. And more recently, during the Trump era, we saw money from a Russian businessman allegedly go through an LLC into pro-Trump super PAC. So we did a report last year called Mystery Money that really looked at some great questions to ask about politically active LLCs or any LLC if you're, working the business beat. And there's a really great spreadsheet and tip sheet, rather, that I put together as part of that report that you can see here. Again, linked to in the PowerPoint, linked to in the slide deck that you'll be getting from folks. But this is a tremendous research vein to try to really track down anonymous money in our elections. And really quickly, before my time runs out, I also want to plug a couple last things. We just did a report about the outsized influence of megadonors in our political system, and using data from the Center for Responsive Politics, we in fact identified that 12 megadonors, 6 who generally support Democrats and 6 who generally support Republicans, account for about $1 of every $13 of money in politics. This is a good reminder that the megadonors always make for really fascinating political profiles, digging deep into what they want out of a political system, why they're investing so much money in politics. So whether you're looking, at one of these 12 megadonors or the major funder of a particular super PAC that's on your radar, don't forget to, occasionally profile these donors who have undue influence in our political system. I also want to mention that Issue 1 is behind a really great podcast called Swamp Stories, all about the intersection of money and power and influence in Washington. We're in season 2, and there's a ton of really great episodes about campaign finance. There's also some really interesting episodes about the election and election integrity. And lastly, as Chris mentioned, I put together a tip sheet that's got, a couple dozen different questions that I recommend asking in terms of when you are looking at campaign finance data. Some great questions to ask about candidates, some great questions to ask about super PACs. And I know that you've talked about some of these tools earlier today, the Open Secrets website, the Follow the Money website, the FEC's website, and a couple other really great resources. So with that, I think my time is up, but I look forward to your questions later in the presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. So let's turn it over to Fredreka.
Hi, so nice to see everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep.
I was a Paul Miller Fellow too, many months
I'm
ago.
sorry, I didn't know that. I've forgotten that. That was before I was here.
Yes, it was when the Freedom Forum ran it, and we called it the Feedom Forum.
Yeah, back then things really were different. When the Freedom Forum ran it, I heard that you guys had like nice, elaborate catered meals and
Cocktails.
When we get together in person the second half of this year, you guys will get some chips.
Well, very nice to be here. Very nice to hear from these panelists as well. Michael has looked at this topic from both sides, journalism and advocacy research, and I'm really excited to hear Rachel and Anu because they are the data ninjas, and I know I'm going to learn a lot from them. I am going to sort of build on what Michael talked about a bit and talk about sort of an approach to this beat, how to ground yourself in the information You're going to engage the people you're going to encounter in this world. And sometimes you have to just go ahead and build the thing yourself to see the patterns. I mean, what we're trying to do, obviously, those of us who cover money and politics and those of us who work in Washington, is to see what are the connections, how is the money sloshing around in politics related to official actions? And then they also tell us a bit about sort of the state of the race itself, who's raising the most money, the sources of it, who's ahead, who's not, how are they spending it, are they spending it well? And I mean, mining the massive amount of data that comes in from the FEC is crucial to that, but there are also masses of information beyond that we don't always tap. And this might seem really basic, but I've been doing this for a while and I have to remind myself of this too. We need to know what the politicians, the candidates, the lobbyists, the administration officials need to report and when they do so. And then sometimes I really go back and actually look at the blank forms to remind myself of the kinds of information that's being sought. Really, and like I said, I've done this for a long time, but I still sort of pull that in so I can remember what it is they're supposed to be telling the public. An example, way back in 2007, there was in the wake of this huge lobbying scandal that involved Jack Abramoff and golf courses and Scottish resorts. And Congress rewrote the ethics rules and set up a brand new set of reports that members of Congress and lobbyists needed to file. And although I covered that, I sort of had forgotten about all of the details. And one day I was sort of mucking around in the Senate records website and realized that all of a sudden, and Michael mentioned these forms, that lobbyists had to start reporting what they called honorary contributions. And this involved anytime a member of Congress was feted at a dinner or there was going to be a new portrait of a chairman installed in a hearing room, or nonprofits associated with members of Congress got a donation, lobbyists had to report this. And what we were able to do was take a year's worth of these records. This is when I was at USA Today. And we found nearly 2,800 contributions of this kind that amounted to nearly $36 million that lobbyists had been giving to honor members of Congress and other administration officials. And in some cases, members of Congress themselves had asked these companies and these lobbyists for donations to nonprofits that they were doing, that they had set up in the name of in their name of themselves or their mom, or and what was striking is that this was just another sort of pool of money coming into Washington to help curry favors with members of Congress. And I mention it because, again, it was just an example of sort of mucking around in the data sets and saying, oh, wow, there is a whole nother category of things that have to be reported here. So I just want to run through quickly some other places to think about looking for data that sort of influences money in politics. Obviously, the FEC, but keep in mind that there's more than sort of spending and contributions at the FEC. For instance, if you're following a member, somebody who's running for the presidency, they have to fill out financial disclosure forms, and you get that from the FEC. And so you have to sort of have a whole process where you fill out a request for that information, and then you get financial disclosures for presidential candidates that tell you a bit about the money, their own financial picture over the previous year. And one of the things that I just do is, I just print out these blank forms, and anytime somebody says they're running for the presidency, I just fill it out, turn it in so that the report comes to me automatically. They're the Senate record offices, Public Records Office, the House Public Records Office. Again, a treasure trove of information in there about lobbyist filings, about the travel records for members of Congress themselves. Nonprofits can still fund trips for members of Congress, and they have to report details on those trips in the Senate and House Public Records forms. The Office of Congressional Ethics, which investigates potential wrongdoing by members of the House. There are Foreign Agent Registration Act filings. And we're seeing a lot more about this recently because the US government is getting very serious about trying to crack down on foreign governments that are trying to influence what's happening in our country. And this is a gem of a database because it allows you to figure out who's been hired by foreign governments to represent them in the United States. They have every 6 months, they have to detail what they're doing on behalf of those foreign governments. They also have to give details on the contract and how much they're being paid. And they also supply sort of additional information. If they've written an op-ed on behalf of this foreign government, that has to be disclosed as well. So there's all this supplementary material. So I say all of this to say it's a whole universe of data out there that you ought to tap and consider tapping. Now, once you know what they're required to report, the other thing that I find interesting and important in this beat is to think about what else they ought to tell the public. And I'm going to give you an example of a story that we wrote back in 2012 at USA Today about Mitt Romney, because we had a history of candidates disclosing their fundraisers, their bundlers, going back to George W. Bush. But Mitt Romney in that election decided that he wasn't going to disclose who his bundlers were. So a colleague and I at USA Today decided that we were going to try to figure out who they were. And so we used all sorts of public information. We used invitations that had come to the Sunlight Foundation that they had obtained and posted, stories in Politico about fundraisers, invitations that we were able to acquire. And we built our own database of the 1,200 bundlers to Mitt Romney. And no one else had this. I mean, it took us, I think, about 3 weeks, many nights and weekends entering names into a system. But what we were able to do was show that a big chunk of these individuals came from the world of finance. Far more people in finance were bundling money for Mitt Romney than for President Obama. And it also sort of helped explain one of the narratives of that election, right? I mean, Mitt Romney was under a lot of intense pressure and scrutiny for his work in finance. And it was a flashpoint in that election. And we were able to establish through this sort of shoe leather typing reporting that he really was relying on the finance industry to help him. The other thing, another example of that about sort of building it is Donald Trump, for instance. He, as president, wouldn't disclose who were members of his golf clubs. And some colleagues and I at USA Today, including Brad Heath, who I don't know if he's going to speak with you guys, he's at Reuters now and is very, very a wonderful sort of data reporter.
Brad actually talked with us last month or 2 months ago about FOIA.
Okay, I don't know if he told you about this story because it's not FOIA, but one of the things that we were able to do was we're trying to figure out who the Trump members were. And so we took a look at the clubs that that Donald Trump visited most often as president, his own clubs. And then we matched this with publicly available database on people who report their golf handicaps. And in understanding that, people wanted to brag about, their scores, but they included in that data their home course. So we were able to use that to sort of build out a list of, I think it was 4,500 members of Trump's golf courses. And then we're able to look at who they were and background them and look at the people who were members of the courses and reported golf handicap scores at those courses on the same day that Trump was golfing there, to give people a sense of the fact that there were lobbyists and contractors and others who made their living influencing the government who were also customers of the President of the United States. And this was something that, again, it required us to sort of build it and match, sort of use a very creative way of getting at this information. And then once you build it, of course, you can use it again and again, because he was appointing people to ambassadorships who were members of these golf courses. And so you could very quickly, when another ambassador was named, take a look at this database we had built and say, okay, what do we know about this person? By the same token, and I don't know if you have it, we also recently did it at CNN, a piece in which we looked at the Fortune 500 companies and the objectors to certifying the Biden election. Again, we built it by looking at, right, so one of the things that we did is that we built it by looking at the objectors, using the Center for Responsive Politics data to see how much had been contributed by corporate PACs to these folks. And then we looked at the Fortune 500 companies, and then we took it one step further. We surveyed them to see what was going on, because there was a lot of noise about a corporate revolt. But what we found is that many of the firms that had chosen to suspend campaign donations had taken a very broad brush approach. They weren't just targeting the 147 people who had decided to object to certifying Joe Biden's win. They just did it across the board. And a lot of them, of course, weren't saying how long they intended to suspend contributions. So this is going to be a continuing story, but it's an example of how you can build something. It's not handed to you. You sort of try to build out the data. And then my final point, in much in the same way that you specialize in data about the candidates or officials you're covering, you can apply the same focus to backgrounding the people that you cover. One of the most difficult tasks for those of us who specialize in campaign finance, I think, is understanding the people and the motivation of those people who are writing the big checks. And these folks are incredibly hard to reach. I mean, billionaires have gatekeepers and their gatekeepers have gatekeepers. And it's sort of like when I do this job and I try to reach these folks, I almost think of it as like being a telemarketer, who has to keep on making the calls, ignore the rejection. You have to be egoless and just keep pursuing it. And the one story, I think I may have included the top of it here, going back to the 2016 election, I mean, there were no bigger figures in the political landscape heading into that election than the Koch brothers. And one of the jobs that I set for myself to do in that election was to really try to understand Charles Koch and get an interview with him. And so this story, I don't know if you have it.
I don't have that one now.
Yeah, no. So it was a story in which we broke news that he was saying that he was willing to back one of 5 Republican candidates in the primary that year. And it was like the lead of USA Today because it came from the man himself. And it probably took me about an hour to write, but it took me probably a year or more to report, and getting to know him, understanding his political operation, his business focus, writing, picking away at smaller stories about what he was doing, the advertising that his operation was doing, the advertising that his company was doing, reading everything that he had written, because he's written a bunch of books about management and he has his whole management principle. But it took me a lot of work to be in the situation to sit in his office in Wichita one day in 2015 and break that news. And so he talks to a lot of people now, but I had the first story of that cycle about what he had done. This is a different story.
Oh, sorry. Okay. Thought I got it.
The moral of my presentation is just that, understand what the people you cover have to tell the government and the public, when they have to do that, where that information lives. Be willing to build it yourself sometimes. You may have to spend your nights and weekends typing data into spreadsheets so that you can see the patterns. And be willing to go in and plunge in and really deeply background the people on the beats that you cover. And I'm going to stop there.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So let's move on to Rachel. We'll hear from Rachel, then Anu, and then we'll have have plenty of time for lots of questions. So Rachel, you up next?
Yeah, hey. Hey everyone. If I look like a software engineer who's being held hostage in my basement, that is totally accurate. I will talk for just a moment about my background and how I ended up here. But my dog is really into barking at phantom mailmen, and this is like basically the only place that I can get that I have any hope of it being quiet. So, welcome to my basement. As Chris mentioned at the beginning, my official job title is, I think it's senior software engineer at this point. My background is in fact in software. I have a degree in math, I have a degree in linguistics, and I have a degree in computer science. So like, I guess a little bit of a grab bag, but software is really my background, but it was never really my main interest. And through a couple of twists and turns, I ended up at the Sunlight Foundation, which is a place you've probably heard about from a lot of people. And I knew is also a Sunlight Foundation, a former Sunlight Foundation employee. They don't exist anymore, but they spurred a lot of careers in campaign finance. I always was really interested in working with big public data sets, and through a variety of twists and turns, I ended up at the New York Times. And for reasons that are like sort of more historical than anything else, they have a software engineer, somebody who reports to technology, who has become responsible for our FEC data, and then some other data collection and data maintenance projects. So that's how I ended up doing this. I want to assure you that the thesis of this is not going to be learn to code, although it is always useful to know who around you knows how to code and to have some sense of like the kinds of things that that a software engineer or somebody with coding skills can help you with, so that you can ask really good questions. And one of those things that I'm going to talk about is ActBlue and WinRed data. It sounds like you guys have there's already been some conversation with the other people. Is that correct? Earlier today.
We had Center for Responsible Politics and Follow the Money talking in general about just how they're awash in that data now. So probably they've mentioned, the difference between, if you're looking at a top line campaign finance sheet, filing, you'll see itemized and unitemized data or contributions. And the itemized contributions, they have to itemize them. They have to tell you who gave them, how much, when they gave it, that person's occupation and employer, et cetera. The campaign has to tell you that. Unitemized, it's just like a black box from the campaign's perspective when they report it. They can just say anything that is $200 or less in aggregate. So that means even if somebody gave $100 3 times, or I guess $150 twice, they should be itemized now, but there's a little bit of fuzziness around that. But that's kind of a black box from what the campaign files. It's just a big number of the money that came in there. However, due to some like extremely weird FEC quirks and the way that things have worked out, there are, which I'm not going to go into, but I'm sure somebody here can tell you the law on that. The way that the Democrats and Republicans now are raising the bulk of their online money is through these two conduit committees called ActBlue was the Democrats one. It's been around for a long time. WinRed. I think the story is that it was named by Trump because he was like, Democrats, they act, we're going to win. So WinRed is the Republican version of that. And what they do is that they're almost like a vendor. They like handle the software and the credit card processing and stuff, and then they transfer the money to the campaign. But because of the way that they're set up, they have to report every contribution that is made to them and forwarded on to a campaign at that same level. So date, amount, name, employer, occupation. Which is really address also. So that's really valuable information, but also in a very busy campaign cycle that causes filings that are like 10 gigabytes, even for just like a month worth of data, when the filing deadline, when the election is coming closer. So it is really irritating data to work with, but it tells us a lot that the campaign's data can't tell us. And the key thing that I feel like is really different about the ActBlue and WinRed data is that if you want to report something like, this % of the data is coming from this kind of people, whether that be geography or employer or occupation or whatever, and you are only looking at what the campaign is reporting, that itemized data,
you just don't have the full picture. You don't have a real denominator to be able to say like this percent or whatever, because the distribution is just not really the same. Here I told you I'm a math major. I'm going to talk about say distribution a lot and stuff. But if you think about it, the kind of person or the kind of, the kind of geography or occupation that would give those larger contributions greater than $200 is not going to be the same as somebody who's going to give 3 contributions of $5. And so it's not really going to represent the universe of the money that's coming in. And so, so the data is important if you want to show the full picture, but it's also hard to get. And so this is the kind of thing there we go. This is the kind of thing that the down to the Act Blue and WinRed data allows us to see, because it can go down to these very small donors and it can give us a true picture. Now you can make a map like this using just what the campaigns publish, but it wouldn't be really an accurate picture of it. I mean, it would be just a weird picture. It would be a picture of everybody who had given more than $200 to a campaign. So it does tell you about where the biggest donors are, but what this tells you is really a zoomed in picture. And we did, I don't think it's worth scrolling around in here, but we looked at a bunch of different features that these donors have and can really sort of give you a picture of what the full donor base of a campaign looks like, or almost full. These filings cover about 90% of the money that each campaign raised, when combined with the campaign filings. So, okay, so I've told you that I feel like these things are kind of important to know about, and I've told you that they're really hard to deal with. So am I going to give you any solution? I'm going to try. I'll try and give you a little bit of a solution here. So I have several suggestions. One is that you should see if you know anyone at your organization possibly who does this kind of thing. It's possible that you have somebody who maybe is not in a traditional reporting role like me, who is doing this kind of thing or knows how to do this kind of thing, or like has a little mandate or possibly an interest in a side project in doing this kind of thing. This is not a suggestion that you hassle your IT department every day to do this for you. It's just a suggestion that you be aware of like what data resources there are at the organization where you work or around you in other ways. I've definitely in my career done this is not quite, I wouldn't call this a small favor handling Act Blue data, but in general, I mean, maybe what you want to do is you just want to know how many electricians from Iowa donated to a candidate. And maybe that's the kind of thing somebody who has some software skills, but not like many hours to put together a complicated piece of software around Act Blue can help you with. Because they could just pull those lines out of that filing, that 10 gigabyte filing, and just hand you just those ones, and you can pull them into Excel and fiddle around with them yourself. Another place to look is academics. There are some academics, and actually there are some non-academics, but just people who are really interested in this, who have this data. There's like a hedge fund out there that is really, I mean, I suspect I'm not the only person on this panel who has gotten a call from these folks who are like, use our data. They're just processing it, and it's like a little unclear why, but they are. I've done some checks on their data, and there are organizations out there that are parsing this data, and with no real like specific agenda or whatever, can make it available. So that flows into my next point, which is use someone else's data. ProPublica, Derek Willis, who's at ProPublica, publishes some of this stuff in manageable chunks. So if you're looking at a specific state or a specific candidate, he might just have that, but also you should just contact him because he's a big nerd and he will possibly just help you out with it. Center for Public Integrity used to do some of this. I don't know if they're still doing it because the person who was mostly doing that has departed. But in general, there are sources of this data that are more manageable and more bite-sized. Again, you could probably pull into Excel or open in a text file and just search it. And then my final suggestion is maybe you don't need to go all the way down to these $0 contributions, to these contributions of $1 or $5 or whatever, and what you're doing. But it is my strong feeling that you need to be clear about what you're using. So if you're going to make a map, or if you're going to look at a state and say, a common one I see is like percentage of in-state, out-of-state donations. If you're going to say like 73% of the donations to the Senate candidate came from out of state, but you're only using the campaign's filing, you just need to be really clear that that's what you're talking about. You're not talking about 70% of donations to this candidate. You're talking about 70% of donations that aggregate to over $200 to this candidate. And those are not the same thing. So I guess my final point on that is just being clear about what it is that you know and what it is that you don't know in that situation. I don't think that's bad. I just think it's important to, to be honest with the reader on that front. So I want to talk about one more story that I worked on using Act Blue and WinRed data. Chris, can you pull up or whoever, Alyssa, sorry. So this is a story, you'll notice that I'm not on the byline of this story, and that's part of of what I want to talk about, which is that this is actually a story that used Act Blue and WinRed data that used almost no software engineering. So Shane Goldmacher wrote this story. The sort of like thesis of the story is that the Trump campaign is using this I don't know if you can, these sort of deceptive tactics. And this has been, they're not the only people who have done this. Democrats have done this too, but they really invested heavily in this stuff. This is actually a good place to stop right here, where they had these pre-checked boxes that said like, keep making, make this a recurring donation, make an extra donation, that kind of thing. So Shane mostly, first of all, he reported this story by, I'm not gonna speak for like all of his reporting techniques or anything, but this was something he had heard anecdotally a lot of times. And then, he found some sources and stuff like that. And he then pulled a bunch of refund data directly from the FEC that was like bite-sized enough that he could get it into a very large Excel sheet, but still it was like below the maximum number of rows that made his computer freeze. So that was data pulled directly from the FEC. Here's what Act Blue and WinRed really gave us. Campaigns can be really inconsistent about how they report everything, but refunds is like a really great opportunity for them to be inconsistent. In particular, what they can do is they can report positive refunds or they can report negative contributions, and it can be quite difficult to figure out exactly what anyone is talking about. So what Act Blue and WinRed did is that they gave us a second source that we could look at that was reporting in yet a different way, but we could go and we could check both of those numbers by using the itemized refunds and the itemized negative contributions and things like that came through Act Blue and WinRed, and we could look at like, did those match? What were they saying compared to what the campaigns were saying? Another thing that give us a second source, and then it let us dig in on sort of like a more day by day or sort of a more like individual level in some cases, all the way down to these people who hadn't given as big contributions that they were reported on the campaign filing as an itemized contribution. So that's, you can see that in this chart that we were able to really look at it. We were able to use like since they were itemized by Act Blue and WinRed, we were able to look at sort of a more time-based version of this. So that's the kind of thing that I feel like is a good example of where somebody who, has a deep knowledge of the domain and can use this FEC data, can combine with somebody who is who has some software skills to really get a chart like this, or dig in and find like a few extra details. Do I have like 1 more minute?
Sure.
Am I done? Okay. I just want to say
1 more minute's fine.
What?
1 more minute's fine.
Okay. I want to say something totally unrelated to all of this other stuff that I have. You can close this story. That I have said that Frederica reminded me of, which is one really great thing about campaign finance data is that it is, maybe somebody has already told you this, but it is a lot of data about a lot of people, in particular about a lot of rich people, that does not necessarily need to only inform a campaign finance story. So one of my favorite stories that I have held, I did, again, this was just like a small research task for a story, is that our art department was doing a review about some art museum stuff, and they were looking at who was on the board of these art museums. They wanted to know what kind of occupations did they have. People who are on the board of art museums have something in common with people who make campaign contributions, which they tend to be relatively wealthy. So we were able to find a good chunk of those people through a relatively automated method in the campaign finance database without having to just Google them and over again. It was like a single search location. Since their occupation is on their contribution, we were able to help narrow down their search space, so they didn't have to rely exclusively on like other ways of finding someone's occupation, which was like kind of a fun way of using this. Is again not, although I guess it is related to Act Blue and WinRed, because if you have the Act Blue and WinRed data available to you, which eventually it is in some ways through the FEC, you can find that kind of information about more people who you're trying to background or report on for other reasons. So
Okay, well, thanks. Let me ask one quick question, then we'll move on to Anu. The data that you got on that last story we were looking at with the chart, it indicated that it was data that came from WinRed and ActBlue. So I'm just curious. I mean, often you'll get, people or organizations will say, "Well, I filed to the FEC. I don't have to give you anything else." But in both cases, they gave you additional stuff.
It's possible that was a poorly written caption and that they came from ActBlue and WinRed via the FEC, right?
Okay, got it. I'm sorry about that.
Not the campaign's filings. I'm not the person to answer that question. I mostly was not the one on the phone with them. So, but I think that in that case, I think that that's probably what that meant, and just potentially poor caption writing.
Okay, got it. All right. So last speaker, Anu.
Hi, I'm Anu, and I'm a data reporter with the Washington Post, and I work with campaign finance data a lot. But my career path to this point, I started off as a campaign finance reporter, and then I realized that there's all this data out there that needs to be managed and analyzed and used frequently. So I taught myself how to code, and I believe I do it poorly even now, but it works for stories. So that's where I'm at right now. And today I'm going to talk about a bunch of stories that we and other people have done using campaign finance expenses. I am personally super fascinated with this specific angle of campaign finance coverage because it gives you really good in-depth storytelling opportunities. So during the Trump presidency, the Post did a lot of coverage about how money was being spent at the Trump properties and the Trump businesses, especially the DC hotel. And we did several stories during the course of the 4 years, which were looking at how much money was being spent at all these places. Who was spending this money? Was it coming from other people, other political entities, and people running for Congress? We were FOIAing for information from other departments like the Secret Service. How much were they spending at Mar-a-Lago or any other place where they had to also rent out rooms because they were on the Secret Service detail? So we did several stories during the 4 years which were looking at this aspect, and we could tell how much money was going to these campaigns, to these properties because of the campaign finance information. And in the beginning, it was trickling down, but towards the end, we did a story recently, and we calculated it was almost $12 million going from the FEC, or rather the campaigns, to the Trump properties in the last 4 years. So this is the kind of patterns and storytelling you can have in terms of looking at just the expenses. And we did this historically. We did it several times over the last 4 years. Another important thing that we can cover using the same expenses details is looking at the consultants and who is getting rich off these campaigns. So when Trump was running for the first time, we saw that his campaign wasn't spending too much on consultants. And usually, especially with really big presidential campaigns, consultants form the core strength. Like, fundraising is super expensive. They have to hire high-powered people to do these jobs, and they're paid very, very well. Trump's campaign was on a shoestring budget. But from then on, it moved drastically when he came into office. And there was this core group of people who were gaining in terms of money from the way this campaign was being run. And they continue to gain money, or probably are even making money from some of his PACs right now. And amongst them and these were the groups that we looked at specifically. So this essentially took all of Trump's expenses and the Trump campaign expenses, put them all together, and cleaned up the data to show how much each person or each group was being paid. So of course, we had Brad Pascal, we had Corey Lewandowski, and Marty Obst. Obst was the guy who was probably least well known at that point of time. And he came up from Indiana and was part of Pence's coterie out there. And he came in from there and he just made a ton of money. Having his company was MO Strategies, and that company was basically in charge of all the cell phone fundraising and text message campaign that you might have seen throughout the last 4 years. So this allowed us, using the data, we could tell stories about people and narratives about companies that were getting rich off campaigns. And the other story which I'll take you through right now was a Democratic firm which seized on the opportunity during the last midterms. It was called Mothership Strategies. And again, we looked at the data, came up with the top 50 consultants, and then honed in on this company, not because they were essentially the biggest or making the most money, but because they were really small when they started. And within 2 years, they had made so much money and were able to cash in on what was happening during the political race at that time in 2018. So we did this story in the beginning of 2019. And what we could tell was, so the three people, they were friends who were working with the DNC. They came out of the DNC, started this company, and they essentially made a ton of money because they got a ton of contracts with Democratic political campaigns. And their agenda and the way they used to work was sending out these fundraising emails, which had this sense of wrongful urgency, which made people want to give to these campaigns repeatedly, that they're running out of money, and they were really successful at it. And we could also tell from other public records how rich the company had gotten, how big they had gotten. They started out as a 20-person firm, and within a year, they were at 100 people. The three proprietors of the company landed up buying $1 million homes in the DC area, all within that 1 year. So again, the story started with the campaign finance filings, but it could tell a story about how these consultants were getting super, super rich. And lastly, I want to show you a few stories, or at least tell you about a few stories which have gotten people in Congress in trouble because of what they reported in their filings. And I'm super fascinated with this because it always comes down to campaign finance expenses. So on that, number one is Aaron Schock. He was quite a character. He was there in Congress for like 2 years, did everything that he could with his campaign finance money, which he shouldn't have. And it included buying tickets to a Bears game, flying in there, and buying seats for his staff, allowing his staff to stay overnight, using his campaign money or money from the House allotted money for all these activities, and it was all illegal. So he got into trouble for that. He got indicted. He had to resign. This is not a campaign finance spending issue. And this one aspect, he actually used his house money that was allotted to him. He converted his office space to look like a Downton Abbey themed space. So these are the kind of things you can keep note of if you're paying attention to your expenses for whomever you're covering. It can be a delegation from the state you're covering, or any specific person who you hear about is, doing something that they're not supposed to. Another more recent and interesting story was that of Duncan Hunter. Duncan Hunter's campaign was being managed by his wife, who was, and the couple were in personal debt. So they were using his campaign account as like their regular credit card, buying stuff, groceries. I don't know what they bought, but they had bills for Costco and Walmart and a bunch of other things. And finally, they got into trouble. He didn't resign. He, in fact, won re-election. So go figure. But these are the details that you can come up with when you're looking at campaign finance records, especially the expenses part of it. I have people been walked through the FEC website? Because there is one thing that I find really, really annoying, which I would like to show.
They have not.
Okay, so back in the dark ages, when I started covering campaign finance, you couldn't find anything on the FEC website, and you definitely couldn't download it in any appropriate form. But the FEC website is a lot better now. They still have some twerks, but it's pretty good. One thing which infuriates me, which I'm going to show you so you don't have this problem, is if you go into, okay, we can go into raising and go into all receipts. So we are looking for campaign contributions coming in from a person. You put in there, you put in the name of the person here, contribution details, and then you have to go in and change the cycle. All campaign finance are in 2-year cycle. So we're in the current 2022 filing. But there's not been more than there's just been one quarterly filing so far, so you're not going to find anything. So you need to go in and like look at what other time periods you want. But that's not it. You then go down here and change the date. And this is really, really annoying. And I have personally requested them to change this so many times. It hasn't happened, and it's a personal failure. One other thing that I use often, if I want to do quick searches, are the donor lookup on the Open Secrets site, which is really useful. And Open Secrets is great in terms of aggregated data. Even though I do my own data work, I often use Open Secrets. Sometimes if I just want something like today, which needs to go in, and I don't have the time to do it, I would go to Open Secrets and get it. Their data is very, very good. They also have secret sauce that they use for their campaign contribution information. For instance, they will have spouses who are taken together. So the total you will find for a person could be very different from what you find in the FEC records. And it can be interesting to use them as a couple together. For instance, if they're really major donors, you probably want them as a couple together. It would matter less for people who are not giving that much money. And for state records, of course, I use Follow the Money. I'm not super familiar with their site, so I often just go to them, email them, and say, hey, can you help me get the data? The site is also super clunky, and I think that's just the nature of how many records they have and how different each state reports the data, and it becomes really hard for them to kind of collect it. But they are a great resource and a one-stop shop for getting state level data. There are some states which are really good. Florida is good, North Carolina is good, Virginia is great, but there are some states is really hard for you to get information, and that's why Follow the Money is absolutely wonderful for that. So I think I'm almost out of time, so I should stop sharing and we can take questions, Chris.
All right. Yeah, so we have time for questions. Any initial questions from the fellows? Nicholas.
I guess really just a question for anyone here. I mean, so when you're going through all these big data sets, what are your favorite tools to parse this? Is it just like scripts in R? Do you go through SQL? What's your, any tips?
Happy to say something about that. I think the answer to your question depends a little bit what it is that you're looking for, right? I mean, I guess that's always the answer to every question, but let me just give you some examples. If I want to know if a specific person gave to a specific campaign in a specific time period, and I can't find that on the FEC for some reason, like something, I don't know if it's been mentioned, but it takes a little while for the data to make it into the FEC search sometimes. So something I might do, if the file is small enough that I can open it in our text editor on my computer, this would be the easiest solution. I will open it on the text editor in my computer. I will Control F and I will look for that person. It'll be clever about it because you don't know, it's going to be like a last name and first name are different fields. But like if what I want to do is find a specific thing, a specific whatever, that is a tool that I think is like totally valid. That's sort of starting at the bottom of like pretty accessible tools, right? Like open it in text edit, whatever the notepad, whatever. Those are like relatively small programs so that they can often open like a slightly bigger file than Excel or something that's trying to mess around with something like that. I would say like at the other end, I write my code in Python, but yeah, I think that an R script or a Python script sometimes is what you need. And then there's like a variety of tools out there. I'm happy to like, there's probably somebody who's written up sort of the best of them that I can find and try and send you. But that's there are a lot of tools out there for sort of parsing a CSV or searching a large file mostly on the command line without trying to actually open it. But I would say that there's kind of no shame in doing the like obvious thing, which is opening the file and looking through it. Would be my my immediate reaction to that.
Okay, any others have thoughts on that question? Well, this is something that Anu touched on, but that's FEC versus other sources. So we heard from the Center for Responsible Politics and Follow the Money today. What is the relative value of? I mean, is there value in doing your own work by just downloading the FEC data versus going to Open Secrets? Are you going to learn more with the raw data on FEC versus what you'll learn from Open Secrets? Are there certain things that you can't get from Open Secrets that you can only get from FEC directly? Any of the four of you, have thoughts on that?
Usually when I'm doing something more in depth, for example, when we were looking at the consultant story, that would be a little difficult to do on Open Secrets because you're looking at a totality of the data. The way Open Secrets data is organized is by cycle. So if you're going through different cycles and want to get some information about the data set, going back to the FEC and using the raw data to make your own aggregates and draw your own conclusions would be ideal. If that is more difficult and if it's a technical skill that needs to be learned to do that and there's nobody else in the newsroom or you don't have those necessary skills, Open Secrets sometimes does do these kind of analysis and pulls data for you. So you can go to them and request them, this is what my need is, and work with them to get you the data. It's possible they charge you for it. They do have a nominal fee at times if it comes to customization of data, but that can happen also. For example, the mothership story, which was talking about consultants, and for that, we pulled the FEC data and looked at it and aggregated that to sift out these other groups that we wanted to look at and write about. So a lot of data work went into that. It was analyzing like 2 million records and data cleaning also, because not all of this data is standardized. There would be 18 versions of mothership, for instance. So to sift out all that, we have to analyze and clean the data, but you can get halfway there just by going to Open Secrets.
Okay. Michael, do you have any thoughts on FEC versus Open Secrets?
I can speak to that a little bit. I mean, I always think that OpenSecrets.org and FollowTheMoney.org are such great places to start for a lot of these things, especially if you haven't looked at FEC filings a lot, or if you're less familiar with the FEC's website. And as Anu mentioned, both the staff at CRP and Follow the Money are extremely responsive. If you have custom data requests, it's very easy for Open Secrets to group like mega donors together with their spouses. So when we did our mega donor report, we asked them for the top 50 individual donors, and we were able to get that list from them very easy. And I didn't have to go in and, download data, worrying about standardizing names, worrying about standardizing spouses, looking at refunds. I think Open Secrets does a lot of that math for you. Even as little as like how much did like President Biden's campaign raise or President Trump's campaign raise, Open Secrets in their summary profile is going to adjust for refunds and a few other things that if you go to the FEC's website, you might end up wanting to do some math, because as Rachel mentioned, by the end of the 2020 cycle, the Trump campaign was giving back so much money in refunds that you might actually be inflating how much money you thought the Trump campaign raised if you weren't adjusting, for refunds by a few $1 million. So I think there's a lot of times where getting data quickly means going directly to the FEC's website or to a place like the ProPublica Itemizer. I mentioned this in my tip sheet as well, but relatively recently, the FEC released a tool called Fec Notify. So if you are interested in a particular member of Congress or a particular PAC or super PAC or something like that, the FEC actually has an email sign-up tool that you can use. So you just put in the committee ID of any number of committees that you want to get email alerts about. So anytime they file a new filing or an amended filing, you can get email notification from the FEC. So on filing day, you can download that new report and see how much money was raised or spent or whatever, or use the ProPublica Itemizer tool. If you want to kind of track in real time who's filing committees, it'll take Open Secrets usually a week or two after the filing deadline to download all that data and get it all incorporated into their website. So I think, big aggregate picture stuff, Open Secrets is really helpful with, that sort of nimble real-time stuff. Being able to look directly at the FEC or use a site like ProPublica can be helpful with some of that.
All right, thanks. I have one more question. I want to put it to all four of you, and somebody will go first and the others think about it. But what is the, if there's one kind of dumb mistake that people who might be novice in doing campaign finance work make, what would a mistake be that you want to warn these folks off of making, in terms of analyzing money, collecting the information, or making bad assumptions? I mean, can somebody start with what might be a thing to look out for? Warning.
Okay, so this is a total on deadline. The reports are coming in furiously on, the quarterly deadlines. And one thing to really avoid is to make sure that you're not looking at an amendment of an old report. So what happens is on the deadline day, the treasurer will file sometimes 2 or 3 reports, and you'll think, oh my goodness, this is the report I'm looking for. And you have to double check the date because it really could just be amending a report from 2 years ago.
Okay, good tip there. Rachel, Anu, Michael, do you have a tip?
Fredreka said, it's also the filing deadline is midnight. So late in the night, you're like, oh, I hope Biden files now before I fall asleep at my computer. It's terrible, but we all do it. One other thing on the data part, which is good to know, is there is a lot of FEC documentation. You need to read it all before or as you're venturing into working with the data. Please take the time to read it all very, very well. The way I go about doing it sometimes is taking the form, like a blank 3P form, which is the receipts for presidential filings, and going over all the details that they ask for it. When it comes to the data side, when you download a spreadsheet, for instance, from the FEC site, there is one field which is called memo. Memo means nothing, but it is actually very, very important. Anything marked with an X under memo is not supposed to be counted. That is an itemization of something which has already appeared before. So if you tally up all that without removing the ones marked as an X, you will be double counting some amounts. So it's just an oddity about the data, which is why it's really important to read the documentation very carefully.
Okay, that's a very good warning. Rachel, Michael, you have one?
I was just going to echo what Anu just said about double counting, that, if you're looking at the expenditures, the campaign has to say, I just paid a $10,000 credit card bill, and also itemize all of the individual credit card transactions. So if you're trying to hone in on the initial, how was the money spent, you might want to look at the memo item, but if you're aggregating numbers, you definitely Anu said, want to make sure you're not double counting both the aggregate payment and all the itemized payments. Or on the contribution side, there's a lot of money flowing into politics through these things called joint fundraising committees. So like you might have heard of like the Biden Victory Fund or the Trump Victory Fund, that like they raise money for their campaigns, they raise money for the national party, the DNC or the RNC, and sometimes they're raising money for dozens of state party committees at once. So if you go to the FEC donor search and you type in the name of a rich person, you'll see so-and-so gave money to, the Biden Victory Fund or the Trump Victory Fund, possibly a six-figure sum, and then you'll see all the individual transactions. Again, that's where the memo lines come into play in the bulk data that you would download or whatnot. So again, you kind of want to make sure that you're not double counting. Usually you'll see like, oh, all of these are on the same date, and like all of the little ones add up to the big one. And so you kind of had some clues that maybe, if you added them all together, you would be double counting and making a mistake. If you go to Open Secret's website and do that, they do some stuff on their end to omit the JFC contributions. So if you type in the same name into their donor search, you're only going to get the itemized transactions. So again, depending on the story that you're writing, ultimately the money like benefits all these people or groups that were part of the joint fundraising agreement. And so seeing where the money went could be the most interesting thing. Or you might want to write a story or a line in a story that says some donor just gave, a $1.6 million check to one joint fundraising committee, and you want to use that number. But what you don't want to do is like inflate and conflate when there's possible double counting. And I think I'll speak for all of us to say, any of the panelists here are happy to help answer basic questions if you have about campaign finance stuff. The FEC's press office is also extremely responsive, as well as the staffs at Open Secrets and Follow the Money.
Okay. And Rachel, did you have any warning tips?
Yeah, I've got two. Hopefully they're pretty quick. One of them is figure out where the big aggregate donors are, and make sure that if you're doing any kind of geographic analysis, if you see a big spike in Cambridge, coming from Cambridge or Somerville, Massachusetts, I can't remember where Act Blue is. Actually, I think WinRed is in Cambridge too, aren't they? Yeah. So figure out where they are. If you see spikes from those locations, look really carefully to make sure, like if you're doing any kind of aggregating and you're seeing a lot of stuff coming in from one location, make sure that it is actual people and not some aggregation coming through Act Blue. I've seen a lot of stories where they're like, why did this person from Hawaii get $10 million from Massachusetts? And the answer is they didn't. That person just accidentally counted the Act Blue data as coming in from a single person. So that's one. Two, I own a correction on this one. So this is like my most furious one. The FEC is internally inconsistent by what they mean by cycle. So you should look really carefully if you're looking at any kind of FEC report or any other campaign finance related report. You should look really carefully on what dates it covers. And you should, if you're going to use the word cycle, you should either define it or you should be really confident that you're talking about what you want to talk about. But I strongly recommend that you just stick to the dates, because it can change. Like if you're saying X raised more than Y and you are inconsistent yourself about what period you're talking about because the FEC is inconsistent, you're going to be wrong and you're going to have to correct.
All right. So thanks.
Just jumping in on what Rachel said right there. Like their new website, has these like January 1st to December of the next year searches. But if you are a candidate, the election cycle actually starts the day after the last election. And so if you're comparing like the PDF form that says like cycle to date receipts, that number isn't going to match anywhere on the FEC's website when you're looking at a 2-year cycle for a House member or a 6-year cycle for a Senate candidate.
Okay. I want to thank everybody for sticking with us. For Michael, Anu, Rachel, and Fredreka, I want to thank you very much for coming and sharing your tips.